Last week, if you were here, and we were pretty full last week, John spoke to us about Pentecost, the first day of Pentecost, from Acts chapter 2. And, I always feel that people get a bit stuck on the tongues bit of Pentecost, and I thought John dealt with that really well, kind of saying it happened, can be helpful, but it's not something to get hung up on. And I thought, as I was reading it through, we stopped before the end bit. And the end bit, I think, is really important too. But you can't put everything in one talk, as I discovered as I was trying to prepare this one. But I just thought the coming of the Spirit has this dramatic effect, but it changed people's lives too. The way they did things, the way they acted, the whole focus of the way they lived. So I'm going to start off just reading a bit. Acts chapter 2, and that's the passage I haven't found yet in the Bibles, which Roger, thank you very much, has given out. I just thought it'd be helpful for some of you to have a page number if you are using these blue Bibles. There's still one at the front if you need one. And I do encourage you to check what I'm saying is in the Bible. And it's 1552 in those blue Bibles. It's Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And you won't be the only person who looks back on that and thinks, how wonderful, if only the church today was like that. And I want to look at that as some of the signs of a healthy church, some of the things that we've just read about in that little passage, but also how we might move closer to being that sort of church, which I think in our hearts we want to be, don't we? So first of all, the believers devoted themselves to certain things. And I wonder if you honestly look at your life and you look at where you focus your energy and your time and your money, how much of it is towards the sorts of things that are mentioned in that passage, and how much of it is really focused in a completely different direction. If you're like me, a lot of the time it's not focused on those things that the early church was focused on. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer and fellowship. So fellowship would have included regularly sharing meals together, and it included the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine in remembrance of what Jesus did. We don't tend to do that nowadays, but I think it's a really lovely idea. The believers had everything in common. They stopped being selfish with their possessions and shared them. And I know lots of people in our fellowship are very generous and they share their possessions. And we're not necessarily called to have everything in common, but we are called to let go of our possession of our possessions and say, this is yours, God. All that I own comes from you. It's a prayer of Ezra, I think it is. All that we have comes from you, and of your own do we give you. We give you back. Give back to God just the things that he's already given to us. They met in the temple and in homes for worship. And the result was that daily people were added to their numbers. Now the apostles, it says, did mighty works and miracles. And later on we find out about other people who weren't apostles who also did mighty works, like the deacons and maybe ordinary disciples like Ananias, who prayed for Paul. But at the moment, God put his seal on the apostles. These are the people that I have chosen. Just as it said that Jesus was attested by God by his mighty works, so the apostles were attested by God. He answered their prayers. He did miracles through them so that people would think, these are people I need to listen to. And the apostles' teaching is now written down for us in the second part of the book you have in front of you, some of you, in the New Testament. So, do we devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching? Do we take time to look in the Bible and find out what it says, how we should live, what pleases God, what God is like? I hope we do. I know some of us have done this together lots of times, sharing God's word together. And I also realised that the early church, it didn't stay like that. For a start, as you read through Acts, you'll find that sin crept in, or tried to. So we have Ananias and Sapphira, and they tried to deceive and look and be hypocrites. They tried to look so much better than they really were, and they told lies to the apostles. And God's judgment on them was pretty severe. They dropped dead in front of Peter because God put his seal on his early church saying this is not acceptable. And you find that throughout Luke's account, it says the church was filled with awe. It actually says with fear. And I think that's a word that we need to sort of just remember. An appropriate fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, the Bible tells us. That if we just come casually to God all the time, if we just treat him like a mate who can be ignored if we feel like it, or we can listen to him if we feel like it, that's not what God is like. That's not our relationship with him. And then there's Simon the sorcerer who loves money far more than he loves following God. And he gets a really severe warning from Peter. You're in grave spiritual danger. Sort yourself out, he says to Simon, who wants to buy the favour of God for his money. So hypocrisy and lies and love of money were there in the early church, and they carried on creeping in. So men reading the Bible, I understand, are in 1 Corinthians, where we find a lot of those kind of things crept in already. It's what, maybe 20, 30 years later? And already things like that are actually kind of quite rife in the Corinthian church. So I thought, well, which bit shall I focus on out of all these things? Pardon me. And, you know, Diane talked, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Diane Bennett talked about generosity, which is a major part of that. I thought, we're not going to do generosity. I thought, let's look at some of the biggest threats that come into the church that threaten our unity, which is relationships going wrong, unforgiveness, like I went through with the children this morning, because I thought we'd follow the same sort of theme. So, how can our fellowship together, which was really important in that early stage, people met together, they loved one another, they shared with one another, they were generous to one another. That can be put at risk because of the way that we are as human beings and we lose focus on God, and there's disunity, and churches split off from one another, and one group of Christians goes over there, not for any particularly good reason, just because relationships are broken down. Now, I want to emphasize that there are things that, if they come into your church, you sort of think, actually, that's completely against what Jesus taught, that's completely against the apostles' teaching. We can't have anything to do with that, and that's true. I was originally going to talk on human sexuality this morning. I'm going to leave that for another day. But when what the Bible is saying is taught in your church, and it's not backed up by the people who are leading it, then that might well be a time where you have to think, well, actually, I'm going to have to find another fellowship. But a lot of the time, division comes in the church because of bad relationships, because we get fed up with one another, somebody gets on our nerves, and that is tremendously destructive. So, I thought I'd look back at the Old Testament first, because actually most of what is in the New Testament is somewhere in the Old Testament. And I've been reading Leviticus. In fact, only a few days ago, I read this bit in Leviticus. And I thought, wow, I hadn't spotted that before. So, this is a much easier page to find, 167 if you're in those blue Bibles, if you want to follow it. Leviticus chapter 19. And just read a little bit from there. Starting at verse 11. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not defraud or rob your neighbour. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear the Lord. I am the Lord's. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbour's life. I am the Lord's. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbour frankly, so that you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord's. And Jesus, in his teaching, quite often went back to the Old Testament. Leviticus and Deuteronomy were some of his favourites, and repeated it, and also elaborated on it and told us a bit more about what God's intention was in that teaching in the Old Testament. All of these things that are mentioned here strike at the heart of community. So trust is destroyed by lying and deceit and cheating one another. We need to have confidence in those who kind of make decisions about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. We need to make sure that rich people aren't favoured over poor people. If you've read the book of James, all of these themes come up, including the holding back of wages overnight. Slandering one another, mocking people who are disabled, and carelessly endangering life. Did you know that health and safety regulations were in the Old Testament? Seriously. I mean, a lot of the stuff about health and safety is about making sure we don't put other people in danger. It really is. So, and then the bit at the end, do not hate your brother and sister in your heart. Instead, rebuke them. So that means not just having a go at them. It means, you've done wrong to me, let's sort this out. Rather than what we quite often do, which is we speak to anybody else but the person who's actually upset us. So John upsets me and I go, do you know what John did? Isn't that awful? I'm sure none of you have ever done that. However, it happens. So, Old Testament, it's in the Old Testament. That's the Bible that the apostles had. That's the Bible that Jesus had. That's the scriptures that Paul's talking about to Timothy when he says all scripture is inspired by God and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. I want to move to Matthew 18, New Testament, and Jesus' teaching. I've gone. Matthew 18 is where we were with the children. Matthew 5 is where I wanted to have a quick look now. So Matthew 18 is the unforgiving servant parable. Matthew chapter 5. And this is where Jesus takes the Old Testament teaching and the traditions and he explains them and reinterprets them. Verse 21, and it's on page 1378 in the Blue Bibles, if that's what you've got. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. So that tells us we need to be really careful about how we regard our brothers and sisters. Jesus takes the teaching about murder and says, look, what's going on in the heart of somebody who's a murderer? It starts with us just being angry with our brother or sister. Then we might insult them in the way that we speak. And then we start despising them and think they're idiots or fools. And when we start getting on our high horse and thinking that everyone else is stupid and we're wonderful and we're better than them, it says we're in danger of the fire of hell. And it gets in the way of our relationship with God. What Jesus is saying here is that we come to God. Now, in those days, you'd bring your offering, your sacrifice to God at the altar, and that would be your main way of worshipping God. And for us, it's our sacrifice of praise that we offer to God. So when you come here, you haven't got a little lamb, and we're not going to do anything nasty to a little lamb, but you bring yourself, you bring your heart, you bring your whole effort, and you sometimes bring your money, you bring your gifts, and you offer them to God. But actually, Jesus is saying, look, if you're doing that and you're somebody who's with you or somebody who's at home because you're not getting on with them and they can't face seeing you at church, if you're trying to worship me when that's the case, then you need to sort it out before you worship me. Because actually, I think he's saying that your offering of worship isn't going to be acceptable to God. God's going to be saying, oh, I can hear what you're saying, but you haven't sorted out that problem with your brother or sister. You've got hatred in your heart towards somebody else. So leave it. It's like, if you've come to the temple, you can't leave your gift at the altar. You can't say, right, I've got this lamb, but actually I'm going to take it back again, even though it's already dead and ready to offer on the altar. You can't really do that. But he's saying it's a radical thing. It's a very expensive thing to give a lamb as a sacrifice. I don't know how much lambs cost nowadays, but it's quite a lot. And in those days, that was your main source of wealth, your flocks and your herds a lot of the time. And it's saying, leave that expensive thing that you've paid a lot of money for at the altar and sort yourself out with your brother and sister, because it's not worth bringing it. It's not acceptable to God. Jesus wants us to take that really seriously. So seriously that in the prayer that he taught us, the Lord's Prayer, it's bang in the middle of that. Forgive us as we forgive others. And we've looked at the parable of the unforgiving servant, so you know some of the other teaching. But Jesus teaches about that quite a few times through the Gospels. I just want to have a look at Colossians. Now then, I haven't actually found this one yet, so let me just find it. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. There we go. And it's chapter 3, which you can find on 1679, if you're following it in the blue Bibles, 1679. Chapter 3, verse 12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. There's some more teaching in that chapter. You might want to look at it later. But I wanted to just focus on that a little bit there. Compassion. Really understanding how other people feel. Kindness. Just being kind. We know what being kind is like. Humility. Not being proud, but being humble. Gentle. Patient. Forgive. And above all, love. And it's so easy for us to be divided from one another, isn't it? I'll just give you an example. A while back, I upset John Smith because I messed up his laptop. I did something that I thought was actually going to be helpful, but I didn't ask him first. So what did John do? Did he go to Eileen and say, do you know what Steve's done? He's messed up my laptop. No, he didn't do that. He rang me up and says, Steve, I'm really angry with you. And I hadn't realised he was angry with me. I wouldn't have known about it. He'd have kind of come up to me a few days later and he'd been maybe chatting to someone in the lounge and they'd all look at me and I'd go, what's wrong with them? But no, John did exactly what he ought to have done. He said, I'm really angry with you. Do you know what you've done? And I didn't know what I'd done, so he told me. And I had to apologise, and I had to be really sorry, which I was. I didn't intend it, but I was kind of thinking, well, I know all about this, I know better. I'll just sort out all these pictures. And we sorted it out. And I'm very grateful to John for doing that. That's how we ought to sort stuff out. Thank you, John. But it's hard, isn't it? It's not that easy to go to somebody else and say, you've upset me. You're afraid that maybe they'll react badly, or they'll start having a go at you instead, and you'll have an argument. Or you've had bad experiences in the past because people have treated you badly when you've tried to resolve situations. Or you think they'll go and complain to somebody else and start gossiping about you. Or maybe it's just that we're a bit uncomfortable about it and a bit cowardly, which is usually my fault. That's what I avoid confrontation some of the time just because I'm a bit of a coward sometimes. There's always an excuse for not sorting it out. I'll do it tomorrow. Do it next week. I'm busy. And Jesus, again in Matthew 18, before the unforgiving servant, he says, look, if something goes wrong, sort it out between the two of you. And if that doesn't sort it out, then get one or two other people to help you resolve the situation. Look, this has happened. Maybe I'm in the wrong. Maybe I've done something wrong, but this person's upset me. Can we just get this sorted, please? What do you think? Have a listen to what's happened and tell us what you think. And then if the other person doesn't even respond when you've had people involved, it says take it to the church. Do we ever do that? We normally don't even get to step 1, let alone step 2 or step 3. And this is to sort things out. It's not to make somebody feel bad. It's not to kind of get them like disapproved of by everybody. It's to sort things out. So let's devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer and to fellowship and making sure that we have proper fellowship with one another by being patient and gentle and kind and forgiving and saying sorry when we need to, like I said with the kids. We need to be humble if we're going to do that. Maybe we need God to come and give us a bit of humility sometimes, because it's hard to say we're wrong. Well, I find it hard anyway. You might not. So if you've got something to sort out with me, you have permission. Now, it might be a long queue, so if you can go in that direction at the end of the service, that would be great. But seriously, I mean, you have my permission. That is serious, I know. Okay. So, I'm just going to have a little prayer and ask God to give us the grace to be forgiving and humble and reconciled. Father, thank you for the wisdom that is in this amazing book, the Bible. Thank you that it hangs together, Old Testament, New Testament. You've not changed. And Father, I pray that you will make us into a healthier and healthier church each day. Lord, that you'll give us the grace, the humility to forgive and to say sorry, to be reconciled. And Lord, you know how difficult it is for some of us to forgive others, especially when the hurt runs deep. Just ask for your grace for all of us. In Jesus' holy name.